Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Harvard Kennedy School. I'm Doug Elmendorf, and I have the great honor to be the Dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government. We are gathered here today to celebrate the centennial of John Kennedy's birth. We've come together, students, faculty, staff, alumni, and friends, to honor the life of President Kennedy and to explore the ways in which politics, policy, and public service have changed since his time, the ways in which they have not changed, and the ways that they might change in the future. We are delighted to have all of you with us for today's celebration. We are especially pleased to be joined by a number of members of the Kennedy family, including Ambassador Jeane Kennedy Smith, Stephen Kennedy Smith, Ambassador Caroline Kennedy, Jack Schlossberg, Congressman Joe Kennedy, Bobby Shriver, and Maria Shriver. I hope they have not left any members of the family out. We are also pleased to welcome the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, and his wife, Madam Ban Sun-tek, who are visiting the Kennedy School now. As a Korean teenager, Ban Ki-moon had the opportunity to visit the United States on a tour organized by the Red Cross. He went to the White House and met President Kennedy. And President Kennedy said to the group on the South Lawn that afternoon, "There are no national boundaries. There's only a question of whether we can extend a helping hand." Ban Ki-moon wrote a few years ago that those are the words, quote, "I chose to live by," and that sparked my decision to become a diplomat and dedicate myself to public service. It is very fitting, Mr. Secretary General, that you are an alumnus of the Kennedy School and that you're here with us today. When reflecting on American history and its meaning for our current era, one can do no better than to talk with Drew Faust. Drew Faust is a very distinguished historian of the American South and the author of several important and heralded books about the Civil War. She is the Lincoln Professor of History at Harvard and, of course, its president. We're very fortunate that President Faust could be with us today and has offered to make a few remarks. President Faust.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you so much, Dean Elmendorf. It is a great pleasure and a great honor for me to be here with you today to help celebrate the centennial of John F. Kennedy's birth. And I'm so delighted to be able to welcome so many members of his family and so many other individuals whose lives have been connected with his in one way or another. It will be such an important exercise to explore the meaning of his life and service, its impact on its own time, and its implications for our own over the coming days. 61 years ago this June, the then junior senator from Massachusetts, who was a 1940 cum laude graduate of Harvard College, arrived on this campus to receive an honorary degree and to address more than 3,000 graduates who were gathered together with their faculty and friends and family. He chose as his theme the relationship between politicians and intellectuals. He bemoaned what he saw as a growing gap between them. And he noted, and I quote him, that the founders of the American Constitution were also the founders of American scholarship. They were, he said, political leaders who traded in the free commerce of ideas with lasting results both here and abroad. The concerns that Kennedy raised at Harvard in 1956 were in many ways of that moment, but the speech has unmistakable contemporary resonance as well. Politicians nowadays do not often cite Bolingbroke and Montesquieu and quote Goethe as Kennedy did in that speech, nor do they routinely lament the distance that separates them from intellectuals. Rather, it seems to be up to us intellectual leaders, university presidents, and scholars to urge public support for research and to champion the knowledge and the facts that they generate. Kennedy's appeal for recognition of what he called the mutual dependence of the worlds of intellectuals and politicians, his call for a central role for learning and expertise, these are all too timely today as we find ourselves in what some have dubbed a post-factual era in American public life. At this moment, it is especially notable that Kennedy reached well beyond the realm of purely practical uses of learning to champion intellectual life in its broadest dimensions. At the end of his speech, he concluded, "If more politicians knew poetry and more poets knew politics, I'm convinced the world would be a better place." 4 years after delivering this commencement address, Kennedy made the rapprochement of intellectuals and politicians a reality. He once remarked of his presidential campaign, "It has converted politicians into eggheads and eggheads into politicians, and both groups have benefited." Numbers of Harvard professors joined his administration, and Kennedy worked to ensure, as he said that day, the broadest possible benefits that intellectuals' learning could devote to improving the world. So as I anticipated our celebration today, I thought about how gratified John F. Kennedy would be that the university that he attended and the school that bears his name remain committed to his vision of narrowing the gap between politicians and intellectuals, between governments and learning, between knowledge and action. Here, people of like and unlike minds share their ideas and research, consider and debate policies, and seek deeper understandings of one another, of the nation, and of the world. Their work together is a constant reminder to me of the promise of America, of the fact that it is an ideal in a perpetual state of renewal. Let us continue to educate leaders imbued with wisdom and judgment, and let us celebrate today a life of public service that embodied those ideals. Thank you very much.
We all know President Kennedy's famous exhortation that we should ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Those words are the motto of the Kennedy School. Some of you may have passed banners on your way in with those words on them. I want to share with you now a recording of the inaugural address as read by public servants, public leaders, and members of the Kennedy School community. That was filmed several years ago. Please.
Constitution of the United States, so help me God. President Eisenhower, President Truman, fellow citizens. We observe today not a victory of party, but a celebration of freedom, symbolizing an end as well as a beginning, signifying renewal as well as change. For I have sworn before you and Almighty God,
the same solemn oath our forebears prescribed nearly a century and 3/4 ago. The world is very different now.
For man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life.
And yet the same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man
come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. We dare not forget today that we are the heirs of that first revolution.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
Born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage,
and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship,
support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. This much we pledge and more.
To those old allies whose cultural and spiritual origins we share, we pledge the loyalty of faithful friends.
United, there is little we cannot do in a host of cooperative ventures. Divided, there is little we can do.
For we dare not meet a powerful challenge at odds and split asunder.
To those new states whom we welcome to the ranks of the free, we pledge our word that one form of colonial control shall not have passed away merely to be replaced by a far more iron tyranny.
We shall not always expect to find them supporting our view, but we shall always hope to find them strongly supporting their own freedom.
And to remember that in the past, those who foolishly sought power by riding the back of the tiger ended up inside.
To those people in the huts and villages of half the globe struggling to break the bonds of mass misery, we pledge our best efforts to help them help themselves.
For whatever period is required, not because the communists may be doing it, not because we seek their votes, but because it is right.
If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich.
To our sister republics south of our border, we offer a special pledge to convert our good words into good deeds.
In a new alliance for progress, to assist free men and free governments in casting off the chains of poverty.
But this peaceful revolution of hope cannot become the prey of hostile powers. Let all our neighbors know that we shall join with them to oppose aggression or subversion
anywhere in the Americas, and let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house.
To that World Assembly of Sovereign States, the United Nations, our last best hope in an age where the instruments of war have far outpaced the instrument of peace, we renew our pledge of support.
To prevent it from becoming merely a forum for invective, to strengthen its shield of the new and the weak, and to enlarge the area in which its writ may run.
Finally, to those nations who would make themselves our adversary, we offer not a pledge, but a request, that both sides begin anew the quest for peace before the dark powers of destruction unleashed by science engulf all humanity in planned or accidental self-destruction.
We dare not tempt them with weakness, for only when our arms are sufficient beyond doubt can we be certain beyond doubt that they will never be employed.
But neither can two great and powerful groups of nations take comfort from our present course. Both sides overburdened by the cost of modern weapons, both rightly alarmed by the steady spread of the deadly atom, yet both racing to alter that uncertain balance of terror that stays the hand of mankind's final war.
So let us begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness, and sincerity is always subject to proof.
Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate.
Let both sides explore what problems unite us, instead of belaboring those problems which divide us.
Let both sides, for the first time, formulate serious and precise proposals for the inspection and control of arms.
And bring the absolute power to destroy other nations, under the absolute control of all nations.
Let both sides seek to invoke the wonders of science instead of its terrors. Together, let us explore the stars,
conquer the deserts, eradicate disease, tap the ocean depths, and encourage the arts and commerce.
Let both sides unite to heed in all corners of the earth the command of Isaiah, to undo the heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free.
And if a beachhead of cooperation may push back the jungle of suspicion, let both sides join in creating a new endeavor, not a new balance of power,
but a new world of law, where the strong are just and the weak secure and the peace preserved.
All this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin.
In your hands, my fellow citizens, more than mine, will rest the final success or failure of our course.
Since this country was founded, each generation of Americans has been summoned to give testimony to its national loyalty. The graves of young Americans who answered the call to service surround the globe.
Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though embattled we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle.
Year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease,
and war itself. Can we forge against these enemies a grand and global alliance, north and south, east and west, that can assure a more fruitful life for all mankind? Will you join in that historic effort?
In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation.
The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it, and the glow from that fire can truly light the world.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask of us here the same high standards of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you.
With the good conscience, our only sure reward. With history, the final judge of our deeds.
Let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking His blessing and His help.
But knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own.
Members of the Kennedy School community are answering President Kennedy's call to service each and every day. Some are well known, like Juan Manuel Santos of the class of 1981, who won last year's Nobel Peace Prize for his work to bring peace to Colombia. Or Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of the class of 1971, who won the Nobel Peace Prize several years ago for her work to enhance women's safety and participation in peace building. Other members of our community, whom you don't know, at least not yet, are also answering that call to service in their countries, in their states, in their cities, and in their neighborhoods. They're doing this across the United States and around the world. Through their efforts to improve public policy, administration, and leadership, they are helping people to lead lives that are safer, healthier, more prosperous, and more fulfilling. We've gathered today in the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum, where the Institute of Politics hosts so many amazing speakers, to celebrate the spirit of public engagement that President Kennedy embodied and fostered. We've gathered today to reinforce that spirit in ourselves and in others. And we're looking forward to a wonderful and enlightening afternoon. Our first conversation will address American power and global security. This conversation will be led by Nicholas Burns, the Roy and Barbara Goodman Family Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations here at the Kennedy School, and the director of our Future of Diplomacy project. Nick served in the U.S. government for 27 years, including as ambassador to Greece, ambassador to NATO, and State Department spokesman. We're very lucky to have him with us today. Nick, I'll turn this over to you. Thank you.
Why don't you sit in that chair? You're right here.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you as someone who was inspired by President Kennedy when I was a young person, by Senator Robert F. Kennedy to go into public service. I couldn't be more deeply honored to be here with my colleagues and with Ambassador Kennedy. Our first panel is entitled American Power and Global Security, an Altered Landscape. And so we're going to try to examine how President Kennedy's challenges, these momentous challenges that he faced more than 50 years ago, might have some resonance in our time. And are there lessons and takeaways, as we say in our Kennedy School classes, that we can learn and be inspired by? And there's no one better, obviously, to begin and lead our conversation than Ambassador Caroline Kennedy. As you know, Ambassador Kennedy was United States Ambassador to Japan from 2013 until early this year, 2017. She had a consequential record of achievement as our ambassador in Tokyo. She helped to strengthen our alliance with Japan amidst the great challenges that we face with a more truculent China in the East and South China Sea and a more dangerous North Korea. She deepened our economic and our scientific and technological and cultural cooperation. And these are ties to a country that may arguably be our strongest global ally. She was, I thought, sensitive and very effective in continuing to try to heal the wounds from both Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima. She was with President Obama on his historic visit to Hiroshima late last year. And she was tremendously popular with the Japanese people, as all good ambassadors do. She didn't just focus on her relations with the host government. They were excellent with Prime Minister Abe and his cabinet, but she focused on the Japanese people. She was very active on Twitter. I followed her on Twitter. Twitter in Japanese, no less. She participated in bicycle races. She starred in a popular music video that went viral. She traveled extensively in the Japanese home islands. And she was, very importantly, our first female ambassador to Japan. And I think she was an advocate for women's rights and empowerment and a symbol to Japanese women of what someone could do as a professional, as a mother, as a wife, and to combine all those things into a whole life. She made a real and lasting impact. We were lucky to have her in Japan. Ambassador Kennedy, as you all know, is an attorney. She's a prolific author. We're deeply grateful, as Doug Elmendorf said, that she's honorary chair of the Senior Advisory Committee of our Institute of Politics. This is the Institute of Politics. She's honorary president of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. She's a member of the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Awards Committee. She's a graduate of Harvard College and of Columbia Law School. We can view Ambassador Kennedy, we should view her, as a dedicated public servant in the tradition of the Kennedy family, the great tradition of the Kennedy family for public service. And finally, I think all of us have come to understand and believe, and we see it from her life, that she's been an admirable custodian of the brilliant legacy of her father, President Kennedy. So with that in mind, please join us in welcoming back to the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Ambassador Caroline Kennedy.
you.
Good.
It's great to be back at the Kennedy School, and it's great to be here with the ambassadors, my aunt, Jeane Kennedy Smith, who paved the way. And I want to thank Nick Burns for his wise advice before I went to Japan. So a lot of my success was due to his guidance. But I really am honored, as I know all the members of my family are, by this celebration. And I want to thank President Faust and Dean Elmendorf and the entire Kennedy School community. And I want to thank the members of the Institute of Politics, Ken Duberstein, Maggie Williams, and the senior advisory committee members who met this morning, and the staff who have worked so hard to keep my father's ideals relevant and accessible to new generations. I also want to just pause to remember my Uncle Teddy and my Uncle Steve, who worked to make this school a reality, as well as my brother John, who spent so many nights here in the forum bringing all his ahead of its time ideas to the Kennedy School. It was here at Harvard that my father became the man that he would be. As a student engaged in the world, he combined his passion for history with his commitment to public service. After his death, our family decided that the best way to honor his memory was to inspire students to share his belief that politics can be a noble profession. The IOP has carried forward those ideals, and we're grateful to the students and fellows who have taught and learned from each other for more than 50 years. I'm honored to participate on this panel with 4 people I admire, people who have been on the front lines of American foreign policy, who are committed to American leadership as a force for peace and stability, and passing their knowledge on to the next generation of leaders. There's no better place to do that than at the Harvard Kennedy School. However, having spent my college career hiding in the last row, I'm sure there's something wrong with turning my back on professors. You never know what they might do. Our topic this afternoon is American power and global security. Modest for Harvard panel. Having recently returned from serving as U.S. Ambassador to Japan, I thought I would like to offer a few comments of a personal nature as well as speaking to this occasion. I had not fully anticipated the depth of knowledge and admiration for my father that still exists in the smallest villages in the farthest countries, as well as in highly advanced economies like Japan. Yes, it has to do with the fact that the generation that came of age during his presidency is now in positions of leadership. And yes, it has to do with the fact that we lost him before his time. But fundamentally, it has to do with his vision of America in the world, a vision of hope combined with a strategy of peace. That's the greatest source of American power and global security. It's a vision he articulated, as we just heard, the moment he became president and lived by all his life. In a few minutes, this panel is going to focus on the speech he gave at American University in June 1963. But in order to appreciate the evolution of his thinking, I think we should start at the beginning of his presidency with the inaugural address we just heard. Underneath the famous rhetoric, there's a tight structure to that speech. First, President Kennedy recommitted America to the revolutionary ideals on which this country was founded. He set forth his belief in a democratic order and a set of rules that our country helped create and was willing to live by. He reached out to our allies, our neighbors, and people seeking freedom. He advocated for diplomatic solutions and international institutions, and ended with his immortal call to service, the motto of this school and a challenge to each of us. All my life, people have told me that that speech changed their lives. It inspired a generation to transform America, but it was fundamentally a foreign policy speech that still inspires leaders around the world. We are honored by the presence of Secretary Ban Ki-moon and Mrs. Ban Ki-moon. I know that you met President Kennedy. You told me about that meeting before, and it's an honor to be with you here today. While I was in Japan, the chairman of the Japan Joint Staff told me that he used to recite the inaugural address in the bathtub to practice his English. At the G7 meeting last May, the Canadian Energy Minister told me that he entered politics because of President Kennedy. The former British Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, who's now leading the International Rescue Committee, was a Kennedy scholar here at MIT. And we were proud to learn that Barack Obama Sr. was brought to America on an exchange program supported by the Kennedy Foundation. Here in the United States, two of the great chairmen of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Joe Biden and John Kerry, were inspired by President Kennedy to seek political office. In fact, I found in Japan that the standard set out in the inaugural address is still what America is judged by. We are still the leader and defender of an international rules-based order that works to strengthen multilateral institutions, advance the sovereignty of nations, and secure basic human rights. We have made plenty of mistakes along the way, including in Southeast Asia and Latin America, and we're struggling now with the greatest refugee crisis since World War II. Simply put, the reality of our policies has often fallen short of our ideals. But over the past 50 years, we got the big picture right. We have avoided nuclear conflict and prevented another world war. We have helped maintain stability and prosperity, which has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And we are still the indispensable nation where millions come to seek the American dream. Right now, there is worldwide concern that we are not living up to those principles. So far, President Trump has articulated an alarming and volatile foreign policy based mostly on military action in parts of the world where that has been unsuccessful in the past. Head-spinning changes of direction and harsh rhetoric undercut our credibility and make others question our policies and our commitments. By the time President Kennedy gave the American University speech 2.5 years after the inaugural address, his presidency had been tested by the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall, the emerging conflict in Vietnam, and the accelerating arms race with the Soviet Union. Yet in June 1963, he announced the first unilateral moratorium on nuclear testing, a commitment to seek a comprehensive test ban treaty, and articulated a strategy of peace. In a few moments, we'll hear President Kennedy describe that strategy and the panelists' comments. But for me, the greatest tribute came when President Obama became the first sitting president to visit Hiroshima last May. President Obama's New START initiative, nuclear security summits, his work on disarmament and nonproliferation as senator and president brought President Kennedy's commitment into today's world. President Obama's historic speech at Hiroshima outlined our national process of self-reflection and reconciliation and echoed my father's words. When President Obama embraced an elderly atomic bomb survivor, it unleashed an outpouring of emotion and hope. Hope that countries now at war can evolve from past enemies to present friends, like the US and Japan have done. That process of reconciliation hasn't always been easy, but it has benefited Americans and Japanese in our daily lives as well as in our national security. The value of sustained, steady commitment to a gradual evolution in human institutions, to peace as a process, a way of solving problems, may be the greatest lesson President Kennedy taught us, and it is vital to American power and global security today. Thank you.
Ambassador Kennedy, Caroline, thank you for that very moving tribute to President Kennedy, to your father, and thank you for being with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, the order of battle is that this panel is going to discuss two excerpts from President Kennedy's commencement speech at the American University on June 10th, 1963. We'll say a word about that in a minute, but we couldn't have a better group of people to discuss that subject. To my left, and he really doesn't need an introduction on this stage, is the founding dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Professor Graham Allison. Graham is the Douglas Dillon professor here. He wrote the great book on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Essence of Decision, Explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the great political science books of the last 45 years. He's one of the world's leading experts on nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism. He was the founder of our Belfer Center. He's made the Belfer Center into the world's leading institution, I would say, Graham, on that topic. He served several times in government at the Department of Defense, has won the Distinguished Service Award there twice. He's been on the Defense Policy Board, and he has a new book out in late May, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? So maybe Graham will tell us a little bit about that today, but please welcome Professor Graham Allison. Thank you. Professor Meghan O'Sullivan is Jeane Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice of International Affairs here at the Kennedy School. She's director of the Geopolitics of Energy project. She's a prolific author. She's a very admired teacher here. She had, I think, probably the toughest job in the George W. Bush administration. After living in Iraq and serving in our embassy, she came back to be Deputy National Security Advisor and had responsibility for both the Iraq and Afghan wars. Between 2004 and 2007, she was a primary proponent of the surge that delivered us from some of the problems we'd had in Iraq. And she's widely considered to be one of the most, I think, our country's most admired centrist and pragmatic leaders in both political parties. And she's just completing a new book, in fact, this week, as she comes to the finish line. So, Meghan, welcome. Thank you for being with us as well. And last, but as we say, definitely not least, is our university distinguished professor and widely admired colleague, Professor Joe Nye. Also, as Graham, a former dean of this school, a great record of public service, Assistant Secretary of Defense, Director of the National Intelligence Council, father of soft power, keenest global analyst of America's position in the world and the changing balance of power in the world. We get to say this about our colleagues because it's true in the case of all three of these colleagues. And someone who is, as Graham, has been here for more than a half a century. Joe, welcome. Thank you. So when we were thinking about this day, Caroline and I had a conversation by phone, and we wondered if we should show a clip of President Kennedy's inaugural speech, but then we remembered that our community would recite that speech, and it is his greatest speech. The speech we thought we'd look at today is a luminous speech, very beautifully composed and very powerful in what the president was trying to say. It was 8 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the near miss of a global catastrophe. And in the words of Ted Sorensen, the president's counselor and speechwriter, he said President Kennedy wanted to re-examine the Cold War, re-examine our relations with the Soviet Union, and examine what kind of peace we wanted, if you could even think of a peace, in the deepest, darkest place of the Cold War after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev later told Ambassador Averell Harriman, when Harriman was negotiating the nuclear test ban treaty for President Kennedy, Khrushchev said, when we read that speech in the Politburo in Moscow, we finally understood that the United States was prepared for peace with the Soviet Union. So a key moment of the Cold War. And what we thought we'd do is show two video clips. The first is President Kennedy talking about the imperative of limiting arms and of a test ban treaty. And when we finish that clip, I'm going to ask all of our colleagues to comment, what do they take away from that clip and how might we tie it to some of the problems that we face in 2017? So let's see the first clip of June 10th, 1963.
Chairman Khrushchev, Prime Minister Macmillan, and I have agreed that high-level discussions will shortly begin in Moscow, looking towards early agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty. Our hope must be tempered Our hopes must be tempered with the caution of history, but with our hopes go the hopes of all mankind. While we proceed to safeguard our national interests, let us also safeguard human interests. And the elimination of war and arms is clearly in the interests of both. No treaty however much it may be to the advantage of all, however tightly it may be worded, can provide absolute security against the risks of deception and evasion. But it can, if it is sufficiently effective in its enforcement, and it is sufficiently in the interest of its signers, offer far more security and far fewer risks than an unabated, uncontrolled, unpredictable arms race. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
Graham, there are two aspects of that maybe you could discuss for us. You're the best person. That beautiful finish there, that our fate on Earth, all of us, is tied together by technology. In this case, by nuclear arms, but we could say in our time by climate change and various other transnational problems. And then there was, at the beginning, this reference to the fact that national interests are important, but human interests, the interests of all the globe, maybe transcend them. What do you take away from that speech?
I think it's just an amazing speech. So I said to Nick when he was talking about the program that if we just simply played the American University speech and had no talking, that would be better, since any talking is going to subtract. But let me try to, that being the case, comment. So this was Kennedy's attempt to explain what he learned in the defining experience of his presidency, namely the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he peered over the precipice, contemplating actions that were going to kill tens or even hundreds of millions of people. And he looked at this and thought, this is insane. And actually, if you look at Bobby Kennedy's memoir of it, he talks about the conversations they had. This is crazy, but it's the condition that we find ourselves in. So he was seared by that experience and became motivated ever thereafter to do everything conceivable not to let this happen again. So what about the relevance? Second, about the lessons. About the relevance or the significance. When we were building the park out front here, the JFK Park, Ken Galbraith and I were picking the quotations that we were going to put. Each entry, there's a pillar, and then there's a little fountain. And we had 11 spots. So we agreed we could have 11 quotes from 11 speeches. And so we were each picking our list. And at the end, I said, no, there's two speeches, two quotes from the American University speech. We have to have both of them. Ken said, no, we agreed. No. I said, I'm the dean. We're having two. So,
and that's one of them.
That's absolutely one of them. If you look out there, if you want to be inspired, just go to every pillar, go to the thing. And it's just, it's a knockaway. And I would say, this is my favorite Kennedy speech. I don't think it gets better than this. This is a case where he gives a reasoned account of a serious strategy for dealing with an insane situation, which is us and the Soviet Union having nuclear weapons, in which if we play the Cuban Missile Crisis over again, we're going to end up blowing up the world.
Right.
So, now, lessons for today. I think, again, when I teach it, I would do a dozen lessons. Let me just focus on one that I think is the most immediate and urgent crisis. So if you think about the gathering storm over the Korean Peninsula today, this is, as I've written about, this is like a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. So in Kennedy's case, some of you, the younger ones, may not remember, so you should go read about it. But in any case, in October 1962, Khrushchev was placing missiles in Cuba that were nuclear armed that would be able to strike the American mainland. Kennedy said, this is not going to happen. No way. So he drew a line, absolutely clear line. over the next 13 months, Kim Jong-un is developing a capability to launch a nuclear warhead against the American homeland, to destroy cities like San Francisco or Los Angeles or Seattle. And from his first tweet to his last and most recent statement, President Trump said, this is not going to happen. So I would say watch this space. Now, in the missile crisis case, Kennedy was prepared to have a confrontation with Khrushchev in public, eyeball to eyeball, with what, once he got into it, he said to his brother, I think there's about a 1 in 3 chance we end in war, nuclear war. And he looks at it and says, what? And a war that kills hundreds of millions of people? No one, that could not be rational under any circumstances. When he came to the last moment, he invented an extraordinary diplomatic maneuver that in Nick's canon of great diplomacy is a fantastic example. And you should go read about it, okay, because otherwise it would take too much time. But when he comes to the speech, he then says, what's the big lesson? This is in the American University speech that he takes away from this. And here's what it says, quote, above all, while defending our own interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations, which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. Right. And I think if we think about that today on the North Korean peninsula, we'll have a lot of wisdom.
Thank you, Graham. Caroline.
I've already talked. I think we should hear from.
Okay, we'll go to Meghan first, then Joe, and Meghan.
Sure. Let me just say what an honor it is to be here today and to be on this panel. Let me just focus a little bit on what these words might mean for today. I think for many of our students, hearing references to the small planet, that we all breathe the same air, even hearing references to our children's future, it can't help but make you think he's thinking about contemporary issues today. I mean, that's the language that we talk about climate change today. But listening to Graham and thinking about the historical moment, it's really important for us to remember that what President Kennedy was really referencing was this new sense of this intense tied destiny. I think anyone who's my age or younger probably grew up just accepting the idea that the human race had the ability to annihilate itself, something mentioned in the 1961 inaugural address. So for me, for people younger than me, this is something that we've never known there to be any different reality. But at the time of this speech, this is a new reality for people to come to terms with. And I would say when we think about that sense of tied destiny and what we think about today, that sense of tied destiny is not new, but there are so many more ways in which our destinies are tied to every single other person on this planet. You think about how much the world has globalized since 1963. So you've had more than a doubling of GDP per capita during that time. So we are now tied economically. So not all of our tied destiny is negative and but we are economically interdependent, a very economically interdependent world. But we're also tied in terms of new challenges in the foreign policy domain, and Nick mentioned some of them: climate change, pandemics. All of these things are really critical issues for foreign policymakers today and for those aspiring to serve in the kinds of ways that President Kennedy called us on to do. I'd just like to also focus on one part of this speech, which I think is particularly interesting, when President Kennedy says, let us focus on the means by which we can resolve our differences. And that clearly is a call to diplomacy, but it's also a good reminder that when we look at these new ways in which we have tied our destiny to every other person on the planet, these new challenges cannot be addressed through military force or conflict. All of these new ways in which our destinies are tied, or most of them, can only be addressed through international cooperation. And so in many ways, I feel like those are just really lasting words.
Thank you, Meghan. Thank you. Professor Nye, Joe.
The speech on June 10th was really quite a remarkable speech.
though if you watch carefully, it didn't have quite the lofty singing of the inaugural address. So I don't think it gets the same sort of attention. But our colleague Fred Logval on the faculty here, who can't be here today, but is writing a biography of John Kennedy, I think would agree with me that it was probably Kennedy's most important speech. And you can say, well, how can you say that? It doesn't have the soaring rhetoric. The reason it was so important was it really marked a turning point. The first bomb went off in Hiroshima in 1945. And what's interesting is how long it took us to learn how to deal with nuclear weapons. 18 years. Kennedy's speech ushered in the beginning of arms control in 1963. It took us 18 years. We had the Baruch Plan, which was submitted to the UN in 1946, but it wasn't real. It was both basically for UN consumption rather than for practical application, and the Soviets rejected it out of hand. As Graham said, after peering over the precipice in the Cuban Missile Crisis and handling the Cuban Missile Crisis extremely well, that was his finest moment in action. But his finest moment in planning and looking ahead and in the speech was the American University speech, because he set in track a totally new way of approaching it. And I think the key point was that if you want, he didn't get a lot of press in the United States. It didn't get a lot of attention. But he had an audience of one named Nikita Khrushchev, as Nick mentioned. And that meant that Khrushchev said, my God, we can do business with this man. So he turned away from the prevalent Cold War rhetoric, which everybody in politics was using, and he himself used, and turned his back on that and used a totally new rhetoric, but even better, he proposed a concrete plan which involved compromises to get a limited test ban treaty. Very controversial, very difficult. And he made a number of compromises, in fact, winding up with an underground test ban treaty rather than an atmospheric treaty, but he felt it was absolutely essential to get going on arms control. I do think that that was one of his finest moments. What's interesting is that it laid the basis for the 4 years later for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the second great arms control instrument. President Kennedy, before his death, predicted that by the 1970s there would be 25 countries with nuclear weapons. In fact, there are 9. And part of that is because of the work that was done in creating arms control and the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as well as the Test Ban Treaty. So I think in that sense, that speech you heard a clip from was extremely important. If we translate that to today and imagine that President Kennedy were in office, you might say, what are we going to do about the cyber age? We have really been in a cyber age in which we've had enormous interdependence as a substrate for all of our economics, politics, social activity for only about 20 years. It's really with the World Wide Web, not the invention of the internet, but basically for the late 90s that we've seen this enormous interdependence and with it a great vulnerability. And we are still at about where Kennedy was in '63 in terms of finding ways to deal with cyber. And I do think that the lesson we can take from this is that we need to take a step today relating to cyber, analogous to what Kennedy did in 1963 and outlined in the AU speech. So I say the Cuban Missile Crisis was his finest moment of crisis management, but the American University speech on June 10th, 1963 was his finest moment as a statesman.
Thank you, Joe. And this was a momentous week in his presidency because the next day he gave a civil rights speech, the most important speech he ever gave on civil rights, calling for an end to segregation. So a climactic week. Caroline, part of what we see President Kennedy doing in this speech, obviously, is trying to overcome the weight of the Cold War and our poisonous relations with the Soviet Union. in a way, in a very different way, you and President Obama took on with a friendly allied country, trying to take some of that weight off the history of U.S.-Japan relations when you advocated and the president went to Hiroshima. Did you see it in those terms, trying to deal with the history?
Well, I think there were a couple of things. In addition to the evolution of the U.S.-Japan relationship, we celebrated or commemorated the 70th anniversary of the end of the war the year before. So I think that, as you said, the alliance is one of the strongest and most complex relationships that we have, and it spans economic activity and scientific activity. But one of the other, I think, motives behind to really push forward on historical reconciliation was also to send a message to the world that is in so much conflict right now. We also were working on increasing cooperation between our two closest allies in Asia, South Korea as with Japan, and trilateral cooperation. And 5 months before the visit to Hiroshima, the U.S. and Japan concluded an important historical reconciliation agreement, in the Comfort Women Agreement. So I think that that this process obviously is never ending, but of confronting and reevaluating the historical record, the legacy that we have. And as you mentioned, civil rights was on everybody's mind that same week. So I think that that process is something that places like Harvard are. It's an important part of our job, but I think that trilateral, bilateral cooperation, and it just underscores the fact that people still do look to the United States for leadership in those kinds of areas. And so I think when we talk about global power, that is one source of our global power, is our willingness to talk about history and to keep moving forward on trying to find diplomatic solutions to conflict.
Thank you very much. We're going to show a second clip that we've chosen. President Kennedy's working title for the speech was A Strategy for Peace, and some of the most beautiful but also demanding rhetoric is about the necessity of peace. So we'll look at that right now.
What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears. But we have no more urgent task. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings.
So we were talking in the room here before we came on stage, and the question I'd like to ask for anybody who would like to offer a thought, and then we'll go to questions from the audience, is this imperative of peace that the president talked about so long ago. I wonder if peace has disappeared from our political lexicon. Because in recent decades, it's vote for me, I'll bring you security. in the post-9/11 world, in the post-Cold War world, in the world of terrorism? I can't remember, but I'll be challenged by historians. A political leader, a prominent leader who ran for office saying, peace is my ultimate end state. This speech was called A Strategy for Peace. I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab at that thought, the imperative. He said it's a dangerous defeatist belief if we think peace is impossible. Graham?
First, I agree with you completely. The line that you have in there that I love the most is that peace is the rational end for rational men and women. So if you're sane, you will understand that in the relationship with the Soviet Union, there is no alternative to peace because the only alternative is destruction. No, not just war. War that destroys you, so is in effect suicidal. So it would be insane. So the only rational end is peace. Now he then, but I think as you said, we were chatting before, more important is than the claim. So the claim is fairly easy. I can find a lot of presidential speeches that talk about peace in a just sort of rhetoric. He's building, as you said, a strategy for peace. And if you look at the speech, there's 10 points in it that are planks that he's thinking about this. Again, one of the ones that I like very much that relates to this Thucydides trap argument that I in the book. He says, I'm giving you a warning to the American people not to fall into the same trap as the Soviets, not to see only a distorted and desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible, communication as nothing but an exchange of threats. So here, pillar one. Now we could go pillar two, pillar three. It's hard for again younger people to now remember. Here's John F. Kennedy. He's just survived, barely, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he might have been responsible, as he and his brother said, we could have been responsible for killing tens or hundreds of millions of people. How would we ever explain this if we have a chance to try to explain ourselves to God? I mean, how are you going to explain what you did? So we're not doing this again. How could we not do this again? So we have to therefore find a way to avoid, as he said, avert confrontations in which that could happen. And he begins working his way through this. The Soviet Union at the time was thought by Kennedy and was thought by conventional wisdom to be surging and likely to surge ahead of us. They had already put a man in space. They were building up their arms. The Paul Samuelson, the first ever economics textbook, was published in 1964. Paul Samuelson at MIT publishes it. In it, you can read it. It says, by the end of the 70s, Soviet economy will be equal to the US. Okay? So they're looking at this surging force, trying to think, what can we do? I would say very analogous, in my view, to the rise of China and its impact on American consciousness and the international order today. And he determines, as Joe said rightly, we've got to have another surge of imagination in the Cold War that finds a way to preserve our vital interests, but to constrain the competition with arms control, to find accommodation, other people might call that compromise.
Bad word.
Compromise, to communicate with people who, other than to send them threats. Think about that. So I would say all of these lessons were really fundamental in trying, as you said before, as he says, we got to rethink the Cold War. That's what he says in the speech.
So lessons today for how we view the North Korean leadership and people, and how we view China in the big struggle for power between the US and China. Anybody else want to comment on this?
Sure.
Meghan?
I'd like to just raise two ways in which I think this beautiful and very ambitious excerpt is applicable to today. And the first is about conflicts that are raging in the world today. When I watch this, I'm very cognizant of the historical moment, and probably that these were words referring to the United States having an obligation to resolve its differences peacefully. But I ask myself when I watch that and think of the world today, What is our responsibility as the United States for conflicts happening elsewhere that maybe are not conflicts of our own making? Do we have a responsibility to wage for peace in those circumstances? And certainly not the only one, but the one that is most evident is the Syrian conflict. And so many times, unfortunately, I did hear the words of policymakers, people close to these problems, that actually Syrians, people in the Middle East, they're going to fight with one another. They're going to kill one another. This is part of the legacy of that region. And so often that analysis was used as a justification for inaction. And I think this excerpt really reminds us that we cannot believe that. We cannot believe in the impossibility of peace, and we should never use that view that some people are just committed to conflict as a reason for inaction. So to me, it's a really, really sharp reminder. One other thing I would say relevant to today, and actually this goes back to the 1961 inaugural address, and the quote that the instruments of war have outpaced the instruments of peace. And I think that's very true today, unfortunately. And perhaps this is too bold a statement, but I'm going to make it anyway. I think waging peace is as hard today as it's ever been, and maybe in some cases harder. And that's not to diminish the military component of conflict, but in many ways, looking at the conflicts of today, we have a better sense of how to handle war. And we have failed so often at handling peace or trying to achieve peace. And I'm thinking particularly about the recent conflicts in Iraq and in Syria, but other places, Libya, other places, where actually achieving peace requires an enormous effort, and it requires actually very specific capabilities, which I don't think we have adequately invested in. So in many ways, we have invested in the instruments of war much more than we've invested in the instruments of peace that we need so desperately today.
Thank you, Meghan.
Well, I think the statement that you heard by President Kennedy, that peace is a rational end, is extremely important, but it also, again, helps to put it in context. Remember, Kennedy had written a book called Why England Slept, and he was acutely aware of the fact that one of the major statesmen, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of that period, had come back from Munich with a promise for peace in our time. And he realized that it's not enough to make peace an objective or a slogan for political speech. You have to ask structurally, how can I attain it? And that, I think, was the major lesson we can get from this. If we look back at the 1930s that Kennedy studied so closely, it was a pretty terrible decade. The Americans become the largest economy in the world in 1900. We tip the balance of power in 1917, and then we go home. And the net result is we don't do anything about providing global public goods, peace and security in the 1930s. And it turns out to be what W.H. Auden called a low, dishonest decade of genocide, depression, and war. Kennedy learned that lesson. Before he did, Harry Truman learned it, and the people around him, sometimes called the wise men of the 40s, and they established the Marshall Plan, NATO, and a whole series of international institutions, which included the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, and so forth. And that produced basically 70 years of a structure for peace, which wasn't available in the 1930s. This past year, in the 2016 election, for the first time in 70 years, we heard a candidate of a major presidential party say that this structure wasn't good, that we should withdraw from it. That is an extraordinary statement. I mean, we've disagreed in this country about Vietnam and Iraq, but never until this past year did we have a major disagreement on the structural conditions for an American order which produced peace and prosperity for 70 years. And in that sense, I think what's particularly interesting is to ask, where are we going to go with this? There are a lot of people who think the United States is in decline. I wrote a book a year ago called Is the American Order Over?, in which I said, no, it's not over, but it's going to change dramatically, and we're going to have to work with others to be able to maintain this international structure which produces peace and prosperity. And it remains to be seen whether that's what we'll get. Right now, we're at a possible inflection point in history in an American foreign policy, or we may see learning where things will improve and that the changes will not be quite as dramatic as some foresee. But I think if President Kennedy were in office today, or here to advise his successor, he would say, go take a look at my book, Why England Slept, and look at that second clip that we saw this afternoon.
Thank you, Joe. Shakespeare asks in Twelfth Night, what country, friends, is this? And if you reflect on what Joe just said, and then the words of President Kennedy from this magnificent speech, President Kennedy accepted the mantle of this liberal world order, the leadership of it, and the structure of it, and the urgent necessity of it, and that is all in question now. And so we have a big debate in 2017 about what kind of country we are, what kind of leader we are in the world. We've left so little time for questions, but we're going to get questions in. We have microphones on the floor here and here. We have microphones in these two balconies. All you have to do is stand up to it, and very simply your name, and make sure a question mark is attached to the end of the question, please.
Stephanie Sanchez, and I was a graduate here of the program, so thrilled to have been here and hear you today. And my question's really for Professor O'Sullivan, just in terms of when you say that groups need to intervene, or countries, we can't just sit by and watch this happen. I'm wondering if it matters which country intervenes, because obviously I think of your experience with the war in Iraq and how unpopular it was that we intervened and created a war in Iraq, and why candidates don't speak about peace sometimes. I was a candidate for the US Congress and spoke against the war in Iraq, and I can tell you it was hugely unpopular at the time. So it takes guts, it takes courage to do that, and the timing is not always right. So I have a question about who is best to intervene, and particularly with the issue of Syria. How do we intervene when we're not necessarily welcome in the area?
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And it's always good to have an opportunity to clarify. I think when I speak, people hear the word intervention, even if I didn't use that particular word. But I am talking about being involved. I think intervention has a military connotation. And in some cases, a military intervention is appropriate, in my mind. But in other cases, being involved in feeling responsible for helping others pursue a path to peace is something that doesn't necessarily require military intervention. And so what I was speaking out against was what we did hear quite a bit in the context of the Syrian war, but in other places, that this is a tragedy for Syrians, but this is not something that affects American national interest. And what we hear from President Kennedy in these clips is a sense that there are national interests, but there are human interests that might be greater than national interests. And so I'm trying to speak to that in particular. So I would say more specifically to your question, it does matter who intervenes, under what circumstances, whether or not that intervention is invited by at least some people on the ground, whether that intervention is unilateral or not. You know, I think about some of the lessons from Iraq, and one of the negative lessons that we very clearly learned was about the whole unilateral nature of that action, which is not to say that there weren't other countries that stood with us, but I do think that the overall intervention at the beginning was done with a sense that this was something that could be done without partners. And that, I think, we learned in a very, very hard way, that doing something without partners is almost inevitably much harder than doing something with partners. And not just because of capability reasons, but for political reasons, for legitimacy reasons, for the purposes of being accepted on the ground.
Thank you, Meghan. Please.
Hi, I'm Patricia. I come from Venezuela. I'm a graduate from the Kennedy School, and this question is for Ambassador Kennedy. Thank you for being here. Your father and Mrs. Kennedy went to Venezuela in '61 they gave speeches in Spanish and English. So my country loved your parents. And at this time of turbulence and losing hope every single day, what would you say to us?
Well, I think hope is critical, and one of my favorite lines from that speech is peace is a process, a way of solving problems. So it's not, and I certainly learned it from my Uncle Teddy, who kept working and fighting for what he believed in, for peace, for conflict resolution over 50 years in the Senate almost. That you just have to keep at it and keep believing in it and keep working for what you know is right and reaching out to other people. So I think that I hope that you won't be discouraged, but you'll bring the lessons that you've learned here back to your own country and work for a better world.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Please.
Yes, my name is Greg Fields. I think probably Meghan and Mr. Nye are who I'm looking at mostly, but the rise of nationalism in Europe seems to complicate the mission even more, and I'm just curious about your all's readings of the strength of the nationalist movements that we're seeing across Europe now.
I think you are seeing a rise of nationalism and populism. It grows partly out of reactions to economic globalization, partly out of cultural changes, which are difficult. You'll find the people who tend to be more populist and nationalist tend to be older, more male, and more white. And you'll also notice that, so if you look at the Brexit vote in Britain, younger people would have stayed in, older people voted out. But I think in general, it's, again, we can relate this back to John F. Kennedy. Kennedy, in the early 60s, had what he called his grand design, which was to have strong support for European unification. And the European Union has produced a very different Europe from what we knew in the past. Instead of a Europe where France and Germany could go to war with each other 3 times in 70 years, it's unthinkable today. And the key question now is whether the failure of historical memory plus the reactions to these economic and cultural changes will drive apart France and Germany. If Le Pen wins the French election, and it's close now to a tie between Le Pen and Macron for first place in the first round, that will break apart the Franco-German motor, which has kept Europe going forward, and could destroy one of the things that's been most important in creating stability, and would be the end of something which was a dream of John F. Kennedy's.
Yes, sir. Please.
Hello, my name is Tony Baslimi. I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School, and I was born and raised in Kosovo and lived through the Kosovo War back in 1998 and 1999. And one of the things I would like to raise, maybe particularly for Professor Nye, would be, is there a place in this idea of peace as a rational end for humanitarian interventions? Even without a UN mandate, as the case of Kosovo was. And obviously, for people of Kosovo like myself, we live today because of that. So do you see a place in this kind of understanding of peace for such interventions? And do you think they actually work? We have seen similar other interventions elsewhere where they actually didn't bring about the fruits we hoped they would bring. But Kosovo is a good example of where that has worked, and I think it is something that needs to be considered in the future when such interventions are made. Thank you.
Well, I think the Kosovo illustrates something which Woodrow Wilson praised but didn't quite understand, which is self-determination. And the key question is, who is the self that will determine? And basically, the fact that the Kosovars were able to break free from Serbia had to do with the use of force, not peace. So if you looked at the Wilsonian framework, it didn't work. And it also is worth reminding ourselves that the Kosovo War was not a legal war under Charter of the UN. It's neither self-defense nor is it under Chapter 2. So we have justified it as a moral imperative and made loose allusions to international humanitarian law. I happen to agree with the outcome of the war, but let's not kid ourselves, it doesn't fit very well with the structures that we have.
I would just add that we grapple with this at the Kennedy School in our classes. When do we intervene? When do we not intervene? We did not intervene in Rwanda, and 1 million people died. We did not intervene in Darfur. We did not intervene in Syria, tremendous human suffering. It's not always right to intervene. We made some mistakes, certainly in Iraq. But I find this to be one of the most difficult questions for our students and for our community, for our professors as well.
So Nick, you should be a member of the panel for a second, because you were in the middle of the Kosovo experience. So maybe say a word to that.
Well, I served in the Clinton administration, and our view was that if we did not intervene, 1 million Muslims in Kosovo would be decimated, driven out of their country by the Serb army. President Clinton and President Chirac had learned the lessons of Bosnia. We waited 4 years too long. That cost 250,000 people their lives, 2.5 million homeless in Bosnia. And I think President Clinton was determined that we not wait long, that we act decisively. The Russians were going to block us in the Security Council, so NATO just formed a coalition and went in, and I'm very proud we did. I thought it was the right decision. Unfortunately, this is the last question. We could take this discussion for hours, but you have the last question for this panel.
Thank you so much. My name is Nam Pham. I was a student here 30 plus years ago. I am also a Vietnamese refugee. President Kennedy said that to bear any burdens. President Bush has been criticized for going to Iraq. President Obama has been criticized for not going to Syria or doing nothing. The US sometimes has been criticized to be a reluctant or uninvited world police, and the whole world is a mess. So should we still heed the lessons or the advice or the leadership of President Kennedy to bear any burden to improve humankind?
Thank you very much, and I'm able to just ask whoever wants to address that.
I'll do a please.
No, I was saying Graham.
I was just say a short. No, I was going to do a short piece of it. I think if you compare the State of the Union speech that we heard at the beginning and the American University speech, they are of a young and idealistic president who imagines that we will bear any burden, pay any price, and whatever, and who by June of 1963 has discovered how complicated the world is. And as I think somebody else recited, or I think Caroline mentioned earlier, in that speech, he's trying to lay out a strategy for peace, but not to be accomplished in a day, not in a year, not in his lifetime, as he would have said. It's a process. So he says, peace is a process. And then he's got a few planks of how to proceed there. So he would imagine, I think, by the time you get to June of '63, that we live in a tragic world, that lots of horrible, horrible things happen, that it is not possible to imagine they all get fixed in any short order. So then one's got to have some hierarchy with respect to the interest, and then some sense of the practicality of things to be done. So he's starting off in that speech on something that would be worse than any other thing. Namely, if there's a general nuclear war and everybody's killed, it's not hard to agree that's worse than the next worst thing. Yeah, then you go to the next worst thing, the next worst, on down the list. So I think that speech is worth looking at. What are the elements of a strategy of peace as a process, not simply as an aspiration?
Thank you. Any final thoughts from anyone? I just wanted to say, I wish we could have taken this conversation longer, but we have to proceed with the program. I'm going to take away a couple of things from this. Meghan's statement that waging peace, not waging war, she said, waging peace is about the most difficult thing we have to do today. Think of Syria, think of North Korea, think of the famines in 4 countries. in Africa and the Middle East. And I'm really going to take away what Ambassador Kennedy said in her magnificent statement at the beginning. And for me it was, Caroline, the power of memory, the power of an idea, the power of a deeply intellectual leader, a visionary leader. And I think all of us just want to say today how much we deeply respect President Kennedy, how proud we are that our school is named for him, because his spirit lives on here. So thank you all for coming here. Thank you to our panel, but let's salute Ambassador Kennedy as well. Thank you.
Comments. We're going to break up now into the 3 concurrent sessions. People who are going to the session on civil rights should go over to the Taubman building to the 5th floor. People who are going to the session on international development should stay right here on the 1st floor. People going to the session on environmental policy should go upstairs to the 4th floor of this building to the Malkin penthouse. And people around the edges of the room can help guide you on your way. We're going to convene